First, thank you, students. You should all know what I learned years ago, which is that Friday classes don't count. It's a thrill to be here. I just got off the debate stage. Well, not literally. I mean, I was on the debate stage. How many of you all saw the debate a couple nights ago? So it was tremendous. My wife was in the audience, celebrated with people in Atlanta. And here with you all because you all have the future of the country in your hands. Doesn't feel like it because you're in school here, you live here, you're going through your daily lives. But the reason why I'm here, the reason why the other presidential candidates will stump here is that South Carolina is going to be an incredibly powerful and important voice in choosing the nominee of this coming cycle. And I can guarantee you it's not going to be settled by the time it comes to South Carolina. Guarantee you that. It's a crowded field. There are going to be about half dozen candidates who are still vying for the presidency when it comes here, and your vote matters a great, great deal. That's not true in a lot of the country, honestly. A lot of people look up and they see the pipes of our government just clogged full of lobbyist cash and money, and they can do nothing to flush it out, but you can. That is the power of this place. So please know that your vote matters. If you're a student here, try and figure out what it means to participate in the primaries, because each of you is worth your weight in gold. I tried to do the math. Do you know how many Californians each of you is worth? About 250 each. That means if you get 3 friends to go, you just got like 1,000 Californians to vote. That's the power of this place. So use it wisely, South Carolina. I'm excited to spend some time with you.
Welcome again to the College of Charleston. I didn't say this earlier, but if you're not familiar with Mr. Yang, he was born in New York, the child of Taiwanese immigrants. After he grew up, he attended the very prestigious Phillips Exeter Academy, receiving his undergraduate and law degrees from Brown and Columbia University, respectively. He later became an entrepreneur, most notably the founder of a nonprofit devoted to job creation in cities that were economically struggling. He launched his presidential campaign in 2017, supposedly, maybe he'll confirm this, at the kitchen table of his mother's apartment. He's certainly come a long way since then, as you can tell by the turnout here today, and we're so pleased again to have you here, Mr. Yang.
Thanks, Claire.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Shake you.
Oh yeah, of course.
Why not? Why not? Friendly guy. So I'll just start with the questions for maybe about 20 or 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to our audience for Q&A. So let me just jump right in. The signature issue of your campaign and the idea for which you're becoming so well known is this idea of a universal basic income, what you call a freedom dividend. So for those who might not be familiar with your campaign or this idea, can you tell us a bit more about this and particularly how you see it as a potential remedy for multiple problems that America is facing?
Thank you, Claire. So I'm going to retrace my steps a little bit, though that bio does a pretty good job. But when I was your age here in college, segue quickly, a couple of my dear friends and colleagues graduated from this school, so I have very, very warm thoughts towards the College of Charleston. This place produces awesome people. At Venture for America, the organization you mentioned, I think our 3rd or 4th hire was someone who just graduated from College of Charleston literally like a year or 2 before, and she ended up growing an entire department. So I've had very positive associations with this place even before I saw it in person. So I spent 7 years running a nonprofit called Venture for America, but when I was your age, I was just trying to do well in school. I took the LSAT, went to law school. How many of you are thinking of doing that? Wow, I kind of suspected.
Yeah.
So you should know that that's a shakier path than it was than in my day. And in my day, you went to school, you got loaded up with $130,000 in debt, but then you are at least relatively assured of a high-paying job at the other end. Now the debt is there, it's actually a little higher, but the high-paying job may or may not be there. I mean, that's just the tough truth of what's going on in the legal field. So I went to law school, I practiced law for 5 unhappy months, and then I left to start a business. How many of you are thinking about trying to start a business at some point? It's great, it's hard. So my business failed. My parents told people I was still a lawyer because, Asians. But I'd been bitten by the bug, and I said, okay, let me try and get better at this. So I worked at another startup and then another, and then I became the head of an education company that I grew to become #1 in the United States and was bought by a bigger company in 2009. So this was the height of my entrepreneurial career, but 2009 was a really tough time in a lot of the country. And if you're a bit older, so let's call it a non-student, you remember how rough 10 years ago was, where the financial crisis was devastating many communities. And I thought I had some insight as to why this crisis had unfolded. It was because a lot of the whiz kids I'd gone to Exeter and Brown and Columbia with had headed to Wall Street and come up with exotic financial instruments and derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and helped crash the economy. So I thought, okay, that's a train wreck. What would you rather people do aside from head to Wall Street or now Silicon Valley and try and become an Excel jock or the next app king or whatnot? And so I thought, well, ideally you would want them to head to Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, Birmingham, Cleveland, and start businesses. But I knew that that's too high a bar for just about anyone, because you can't just like move to a place and start a business unless you've got a whole lot of things going for you. And so I thought, well, maybe they could do what I did, which is work for a more experienced entrepreneur for a couple of years as their apprentice or lieutenant, and then at the end of a couple of years, if they wanted to start a business, then we'd try and help them do so. So I thought, well, this sounds like Teach for America for startups. Like, that's a great idea. What do you call that? Venture for America. I'm not very imaginative, as you can tell. So I put in some of my own money to start Venture for America. Then I started calling rich friends with this question: do you love America? And then the smart among them said, what does it mean if I say yes? And then I said, at least $10,000. And then 12 of them said, I love America for 10K. I was like, I thought you did. And so we started with a couple 100,000 that grew to the millions, helped create several thousand jobs around the country over 7 years. Very, very proud of the work I did with Venture for America. But I saw firsthand the aftermath of the automation of manufacturing jobs in Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, and other cities around the country. And I was staggered by the gulf between regions, where when you fly between St. Louis and San Francisco, or Michigan and Manhattan, you feel like you're crossing dimensions and decades and ways of life, and not just a few time zones. And then Donald Trump became our president in 2016. And we all have friends and family that were very excited about that outcome. I do. To me, it was a giant red flag that tens of millions of Americans decided to take a bet on the narcissist reality TV star. It said, okay, things are really not going well for a lot of people. They don't feel like they're being served well by our government, which I get. And so I looked at it and said, okay, how did this happen? And I realized that my work and why this had happened were directly tied together, where we've automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all of the swing states that Trump won. And now what we did to those jobs, we're doing to retail jobs, call center jobs, fast food jobs, truck driving jobs, and on through the US economy. How many of you have noticed self-serve kiosks in a fast food restaurant? They're going to be in every McDonald's location in the next 2 years. How many of you have seen retail stores closing? Amazon's closing 30% of America's stores and malls and paying 0 in federal taxes. So I looked up and realized the enormity of this fourth industrial revolution that's already tearing our country apart. And our news media either doesn't understand it or doesn't want to talk about it. We're scapegoating immigrants for problems immigrants have nothing to do with. So I'm figuring all this out in 2017, and I go to Washington, D.C., and I say, what are we going to do to help people transition through the fourth industrial revolution? And they wanted nothing to do with it. Literally, the answers I got were, number one, we cannot talk about that. Number two, we should study that further. And number three, we must educate and retrain all Americans for the jobs of the future. And I said, that last one sounds great, but I looked at the studies. Do you all want to guess how effective the government-funded retraining programs were for the manufacturing workers in the Midwest who lost their jobs? Go ahead, throw a number out. 10%. Yeah, I'm anchoring you low because it is low. It's 0 to 15%. They're a total dud. And then when I said that to the folks in DC, they said, well, I guess we'll get better at it. So these are the solutions that are coming out of Washington, and the truth is they don't care. There was a person in DC who said something that led me to run for president. He said, Andrew, you're in the wrong town. No one here is going to do anything about this because fundamentally DC is a town of followers, not leaders. And the only way we will do anything about it is if you were to create a wave in other parts of the country and bring that wave crashing down on our heads. And I said, challenge accepted. I'll be back in 2 years. Because that was 2 years ago, and here we are. So the question is, how do we help our people manage this transition? And this is back to your original question, Claire, which is this $1,000 a month for every American. And I know the first time you heard it, it sounded like a gimmick or a joke, but the truth is this idea has been with us since our founding. Thomas Paine was for it, called it the citizen's dividend. Martin Luther King fought for it, and it was what he was fighting for when he was assassinated in 1968, called it the guaranteed minimum income for all Americans. And one state has had a dividend for almost 40 years, where now everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And what state is that?
Alaska.
And how do they pay for it?
Oil.
And what is the oil of the 21st century? Technology, AI, big data, software, self-driving cars and trucks. Right now, Amazon closing 30% of America's stores and malls, trillion-dollar company paying zero in taxes. Does that sound like a sustainable arrangement to you all? No, it's terrible. It's like, and it's not their fault, it's our fault. We're so dumb and so bought and sold by these companies that we're like, oh, you're paying zero in taxes? Well, I guess you follow the rules, like moving right along. We have structural problems that are very, very deep. And the way we actually rewrite the rules of the 21st century economy to work for people is by making us all owners and shareholders in the innovations and gains. And if anyone suggests to you that we do not have the money, again, just say, look, Amazon's a trillion-dollar tech company paying zero in taxes. You know, we have the money. It's just none of it's coming to us. Like, being a retail clerk's the most common job in South Carolina and most of the country. What is the 39-year-old woman who works at that store making $9 to $10 an hour going to do when her store closes? Like, that is the product of Amazon's hoovering up this much value over time. And Amazon's paying zero back into the system. That woman's going to see none of it. So what we have to do is we have to actually start spreading the gains from innovation and progress as broadly as possible, and that's what the freedom dividend would do. In real terms, $1,000 a month in each of your hands, how many of you would find that to be a positive difference maker in your lives? Yeah, and if you don't have your hand up, then I don't. Then you must be very, very well off. And one of the jokes I tell is that, like, if $1,000 a month would make no difference in your life, then you probably should have no problem with other people getting it. And I do know people that resemble that, and most of them I'm happy to say are on board, even the ones that would be paying, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars into the system. I've been endorsed by Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Sam Altman, Alexis Ohanian, all these tech giants who know that this is going to hurt their pocketbook, but they think that we have bigger interests at heart. That it's a very, very bad environment for innovation if more and more Americans feel left behind.
And so your idea, just to build on that, is that this $1,000 then comes back into the economy, if I'm correct in
100%.
understanding that.
Because when you get this money, thank you, South Carolina, when you get this money, how are you going to spend it in real life?
Paper towels?
Rent, paper towels, down the street.
I need that today.
If you're a student here, probably school costs, tuition payments. Retirement. But how much of it's going to stay here in South Carolina? Most of it. A little bit of it's going to float up to the cloud. You know, you'll actually get your own Netflix account instead of just using your friend's password. But most of it would go right here into the stuff of life, to car repairs and daycare and Little League signups and local businesses. This is the trickle-up economy from our people, our families, and our communities up. And this would work 100%. And it's one reason why some of the big companies also are in favor of this, because they know they'll get more business out of it. One person who is in favor of a variant of this plan is Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. Do you think that Chase is going to have some more banking customers if everyone's getting $1,000 a month? Sure. Target, you know, AT&T, maybe you'll upgrade to Verizon. I don't know. I'm just like,
Do I get a free phone?
You know what I mean? Like, it's like businesses win. It's a trickle-up economy. It's a virtuous cycle.
Thanks.
No problem. Thank you, Claire.
You're welcome. So if I could just switch gears a little bit, another part of your campaign that's getting a lot of notice and actually admiration is that you've really been building a coalition of supporters, you see many of them here today, who are really ideologically diverse, which is not very common in today's political environment. You have supporters who call themselves progressive, libertarians, disaffected, even former Trump voters who now wear this Make America Think Harder hat. Can you speak a little bit about how you've been so successful at this, and if you think it's something you can bring with you to the White House?
Thank you, Yang Gang, and thank you everyone who supported the campaign. You guys are the best. Thank you. And I think they would agree that they are very ideologically diverse. We're being ill-served by our current two-party system. The fact is, independents outnumber either Democrats or Republicans almost 2 to 1. You know, the numbers are something like 29% Dem, 23% Republican, and then I think it's like 41% independent. Now, I've been now part of the Democratic nomination process for a little while now, and the majority of independents would not necessarily feel like their perspectives are being incorporated into either party's processes. So, for me, the fact that the Yang Gang represents this unspoken for independent segment of the population is very exciting to me. Because I'd consider myself an independent in many respects. I'm a registered Democrat, don't worry Democrats. I'm a registered Democrat, voted Dem, worked in the Obama administration, no. But, all that said, I don't consider myself particularly ideological. It's like we just have to figure out what works on the ground. If it works, let's do it. If someone has a better idea, I don't care what party they're from. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea. The universal basic income, this freedom dividend, this is traditionally bipartisan. Richard Nixon passed, or tried to pass a version of it in 1971 called the Family Assistance Plan. So everyone from Martin Luther King to Elon Musk to Milton Friedman has been for a version of universal basic income. And the state that has it, Alaska, is a deep red conservative state. It was passed by a Republican governor. And that governor said to the Alaskan people, hey, a lot of oil money. Who would you rather get it, you or the government who's going to mess it up somehow? And the Alaskan people said, us please. And he's like, oh, I thought you'd say that. I prefer that too. So now they have a dividend. And that's not a terribly ideological solution. It's just like a more efficient resource allocation solution. So I'm thrilled that we're activating people that haven't felt spoken for in politics. And that includes a lot of young people too, which makes me very happy. I'm now third in climbing among young people. So thank you, young people. And it's exciting to me because I'm genuinely running because I feel terrible about the world we're leaving our kids. I mean, I have 2 boys who are 7 and 4, a bit younger than you all. But we've left you record high levels of anxiety, depression, mental illness, student loan debt, an incredibly insecure job market, and then we've somehow blamed you for it. Say that it's somehow an attitude problem. Like, it's really immoral. I mean, climate change, I mean, I could go on and on. Like, why has college gotten 2.5 times more expensive than when I went? Has it gotten 2.5 times better? No, it has not. No offense, Claire.
None taken.
No.
My class accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, so that's the kind of thing where if you're an 18-year-old or 20-year-old, you just have to accept. You're like, all right, I guess college is $60,000 now. It's like, I guess that's the way it goes. So we're leaving you with a bill of goods, and it's not right. Like, we have to rewrite the rules so that we're actually proud of the country we're leaving to our young people.
Yeah, and you've spoken about this. You've been using the phrase, our kids are not all right, which is as an educator and as a parent myself, is a very poignant phrase.
How old are your kids?
I have a 2.5-year-old and a 7-year-old.
Oh, wow, congratulations, wow.
Thank you.
Wow.
We're tired
Fantastic.
but happy. As I'm sure
Yeah, my older is 7 too, and
Yep.
2.5. I mean, that's a great time, but a very tiring time.
Well, what can we say to these kids?
You can afford to wait, kids. No.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
What can we say to help me solve the problem? So, what can we say to these young people if we acknowledge them? Hey, we've left you with these difficult situations. How are we going to address this challenge? Like, where's our hope? What should they do? What can we do?
It's really tough because I believe that.
That's why I'm asking you.
Well, I believe that people are really savvy, honestly. And so if you tell them something, they're like, yeah, that's actually not going to work. It's one reason why people have checked out of our politics, where they look up and say, like, my vote's not going to matter, and whatnot. And I will say, in a lot of the country, like South Carolina, your votes truly do matter more than is the case in most of the rest of the country. So for young people, we need your help to fix the problems that we have left you. And there is the political system, which is going to hopefully, if I win, start to address some of like the worst injustices. But most of it's going to be in your hands in your own personal life. It's on building your own relationships, your own attitude. There's something called an internal locus of control, where it's like if something bad happens to you, you either say it's like, oh, it's someone else's fault, or it's like, oh, what could I have done differently? And studies have shown that the more you adopt the latter attitude, which is like, what could I have done differently, then the more it corresponds to your contentment, your satisfaction, better relationships, success in life. So when you know, I mean, we have jokes too with my wife and I, because we have 2 young kids as well. And so whenever something goes wrong, we jokingly look at each other and be like, who are we gonna blame for this? Who are we gonna blame for this? You know what I mean? Happily, in our case, it's a joke. You know, it's like, even though we have left you with total messes, unfortunately, what the better attitude for you has to be like, okay, like what can I do to improve my situation? And as someone who's running for president, I think that we're putting way too much stock in both our government and the presidency. It's like the presidency and government hopefully can address some of the biggest problems, but the real problems that face most people are day-to-day relationships and trials and stresses, and trying to get better yourself each day. And that's something that, frankly, no government or no president's going to be able to do on your behalf.
Great, thank you so much.
Do I sound like a parent?
No.
Yeah.
We could go on and on about our kids, but I have several more questions, but of course I'm going to turn it over to the most important people here, no offense, please, which is our audience.
I agree.
So good. So to begin our Q&A, I'd like to welcome several of our best and brightest here to the stage to monitor the microphones. We have Allegra Campbell, who's a senior and president of the Political Science Club, and Will Meese, who's senior and president of the College of Charleston Democrats. And they are going to be taking questions from the audience. I'm sure you have many. I hope you have many.
First question.
Right there in the middle?
Yeah. For me?
Yeah.
Okay,
There you
thank
go.
you for coming. I was reading on your website about like decriminalization of like marijuana and stuff like that. I see that you're for that. My question is for the people that are, you know, released from prison, are there going to be any programs for them to get back into jobs? Because, you know, once you go to jail, it's incredibly hard to, you know, do anything afterwards. It's almost impossible to like get back on your feet. So I was just wondering if you had any programs to help out those people that are in there for petty charges.
Thank you for the question. I'm pro the legalization of marijuana around the country. On campus, that's generally an applause line. You guys afraid because it's like, you know, administrators are there being
The
like,
teachers are here.
you know, are they gonna like this? Anyway. I was sort of laughing when Corey was like, you know, slagging Joe on stage. I was like, oh man, Corey. It's like, I'm with you, Corey, but I'm not gonna, anyway. And the reasons for that are that, like, I'm not a consumer of marijuana in the sense of, you know, I'm not like a heavy user, though I do have friends, you know, who love pot. But to me, it's clear we should legalize it because right now it's legal in some parts of the country, and our current administration of our drug laws is deeply uneven and racist in its administration. Like, if you look at who's in jail for pot-related crimes, it's vast majority people of color. And the third thing is it's a better means of pain relief for many, many Americans than prescription opiates, which have much higher fatality rates. Like, I mean, the fatality rate around marijuana is like essentially zero, and the fatality rate around opiates is unconscionable. Like, we have 8 Americans dying of drug overdoses, primarily opiates, every hour in this country because of the opiate plague that has overtaken a lot of us. So in that context, the legalization of marijuana seems like a very straightforward thing to do. Though legalization doesn't mean complete deregulation. Like, there are rules around legal substances in this country, like tobacco and alcohol, et cetera. And I would pardon everyone who's in jail for a nonviolent pot-related offense. So to the original question, it's like, to me, it's odd that the folks that get pardoned by the president tend to be rich, well-connected weirdos. It's like, I'd rather pardon someone who shouldn't have been in jail in the first place that no one's ever heard of. You know what I mean? And like that seems to me to be a better exercise of it. So the question is, what awaits them when they get out? And that's not just true for people who are being released due to pot-related crimes. That's true for anyone who's coming out of jail. Because the fact is, when you come out of jail, and Fred has spoken to this. Fred's a friend who spent some time behind bars. I mean, it's fine. Yeah, and helped people. And he helped people reintegrate into society. He now has his own business. So I just had a long. Yeah, we can give Fred a round of applause on that, sure. And so Fred and I had this long conversation about it, where Fred's like, "Hey, why don't people just like do what I did?" And I'm like, "Fred, like not everyone can just do what you did. Like you're not like you know." And like I know this about entrepreneurs too. It's like entrepreneurs fail more often than they succeed. It's just you see more of the success than the failure. You know, it's like when someone asks you how your business is going, what do you have to say? Awesome. It's going great. You're not allowed to like open it up and be like, "Oh, so many problems." You know what I mean? The same with having kids. You know, really. So how are your kids? Great. Oh, you're like, bah. So the question is, how do we actually have a path forward for people to reintegrate into society in a positive way? And I'm going to suggest that $1,000 a month is certainly a fantastic starting point, where people will actually be excited to see them when they come home, because they'll be coming with a check. And then they're gonna show up, and then people will be like, "Wow, things really improved since I went in. Like President Yang is really doing some things." And do you think they'll be less likely to go back to jail if they know they lose their $1,000 a month if they're in jail? Yeah, because we're going to spend the money on their incarceration, so obviously they don't get it. And so they'll be like, "Wait a minute, I get $1,000 a month if I'm outside." And this is not just me talking. It was a corrections officer in New Hampshire who said to me, "We should pay people to stay out of jail, because when they're in jail, we spend so much more on them." And this is a prison guard telling me this. Like, he was staring at it. He saw how much money we're spending on this punitive, inhumane incarceration system. So $1,000 a month is a great way to start, but I do have programs in place to try and channel some of the tax revenue from marijuana-related businesses, which is going to be very significant, into African-American communities, so that they actually are able to benefit from the new tax revenue. So there are a lot of things we need to do to help people reintegrate into society. I just want to speak a little bit more on this. Like, a lot of it's what's going on in the prison system. We have to get rid of private prisons. There's no reason to have prisons that profit from shoddy treatment of inmates and recidivism rates. It's like, imagine a business model. It's like, hey, if we screw up and you come back, we make more money. I mean, that's perverse. We need to stop criminalizing poverty in this country. There are thousands, tens of thousands who are in jail because they couldn't afford bail. You got to get rid of this punitive cash bail system. And the toughest part is trying to make our prisons a place where folks actually are in a position to get an education or to develop in some meaningful way. Right now, that's not the way our system is designed. Our system is designed really primarily for punishment.
Another question over here, perhaps?
Hey there, Andrew. Thanks for coming to Charleston, South Carolina. But my question is about, I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and St. Louis has been known as one of the most violent cities in the United States. And this happens also in other Midwestern cities like Detroit and Cleveland as well. And here in Charleston, South Carolina, we're one of the biggest tourist cities in the United States. But you go 10 minutes north of Charleston and you get into North Charleston, it becomes one of the most violent cities in America. So what can $1,000 a month freedom dividend do to these people that are living in these neighborhoods and communities that are riveted with violence? And also, what can that do with the massive disparity of wealth that happens in cities like Charleston, where you go from Sullivan's Island, the richest zip code in South Carolina, to North Charleston or Somerville or Allendale or stuff like that?
Thank you for the question. Thank you so much. We're in the most extreme winner-take-all economy and society in our nation's history. And so the inequities you might see locally here are playing out in different areas around the country. Now, $1,000 a month is not a cure-all, but it does reduce income inequality, at least at the margins. Because $12,000 a year is a lot more meaningful if you're making $12,000 a year. than if you're making $200,000 a year. Making $200,000 a year, it's like, oh, this is nice. You're making 12, then it's a game changer. Now, that does not begin to address the structural inequities or the epidemic of gun violence in this country that's racking many, many communities, particularly communities that are struggling with economic loss. So I've looked into the causes of gun violence, and I'm for common sense gun safety laws that the majority of Americans support, universal background checks and red flag laws. But I don't have the illusion that these laws are going to necessarily reduce gun violence to the level that some people would hope. Because when you think about the causes of gun violence in the communities you're talking about, first it starts at the family and in the home, and then it gets to the schools, and then it gets to our mental health infrastructure, which is completely lacking in many, many places. And then it gets to what sort of opportunities that people, particularly young men, access, because we have to face facts that 96% of the shooters we're talking about are boys and men. You know, like this is a men problem. And our schools in particular are very poorly designed to help turn boys into strong, healthy young men. It's not just the schools, but the schools are a part of it. One thing that we could do that I believe would help at the margins would be to de-emphasize standardized testing in these schools, because right now the teachers are caught in this bind where they're trying to teach the test and it's leaving kids behind. Did you all know that we invented the SAT during World War II as a means to figure out which kids not to send to the front lines? Think about how dark that is. And now we treat our kids like every year is wartime. We're like, ooh, let's like lay the wartime test on our 12-year-olds or whatever we're doing. So what happens is the kids get to school and the school feels like a bit of an assembly line. And our boys have different maturation rates. And so they're falling behind in various ways, and then they feel like, oh, school's not for me, and then they drop out, and they wind up doing things that aren't very positive, and then eventually they fall in with like a culture of violence. So it starts with the family, trying to keep families together. 2/3 of our kids' education outcomes are determined by what's going on outside of the school. So this is words read to them, and Claire and I live this every day. Words read to the kid when they're very young, parental time spent with them, stress levels in the house, type of neighborhood. You put money into the home, you actually give the kid a much better chance to learn and the teachers a much better chance to teach. So to me, there are, let's call it like 8 or 9 steps on the path to gun violence, and you have to try and intercept each one in turn. Now that's a very, very high bar, but we don't have a choice. Like, we can't pretend that if we pass, I looked at the Santa Clarita shooting in California, it was not an automatic weapon, it had no criminal record, like there are very, very few, he was 16 years old, there were very, very few rules that if you'd had in place would have prevented that from happening. So you have to go very, very deep if you want to actually try and stem the tide of gun violence. Sorry, I'm passionate about this, I'm going to say something else on it. We also have to look at it and say almost 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. And so this is and most of us know that if you had a self-destruct button on your body, you would have pushed it at a moment of weakness or despair or shame or guilt. And then the moment passes and then it's fine. But if you're a gun owner in the wrong circumstance, you make that choice and it's irrevocable, and you would have regretted a moment later, but there is no coming back from it. So we have to look up and say, look, gun violence isn't just perpetrated on other people. The gun owner is often a victim, and this is tied into a lot of the causes of despair and the mental health problems in our country.
Another question over here.
What's up, Andrew? My name is Fred. I'm in the throes of misery as a young lawyer. But my question is, what's your plan to address foreign election interference?
Thank you, Fred. Stick with it, man. You look great. You look like a dashing young lawyer. It's awesome. So I've talked to folks who are in, and this is the tough truth of it. We have done very, very little since 2016 to secure our infrastructure from foreign interference. The current administration's like, it's not a problem. And our infrastructure right now is this hodgepodge because if you look at the voting machines, they're generally administered locally. What's funny is in many cases, like the lowest tech machines are actually the most secure because it's not like a Russian kid like sneak in there and like punch like, holes in like your paper card or whatever. So there's this whole hodgepodge. The means towards genuine election security would be to invest federal resources and have some kind of real modernization. Now the modernization itself would be a double-edged sword for a while, because if you were to have real standards, then it's like in order to make it more secure and you enforce uniformity, you also actually increase the chance of widespread hacking. So there would be a period during which you'd probably have some kind of redundancy where you're like, look, we're gonna try and modernize this, but we're gonna like have some fail safes in place. The ultimate goal, which is achievable, is that we actually can vote in a completely secure way on our phones. Like that's actually technologically feasible. There are folks in our government, unfortunately, that don't love the idea of everyone voting. I mean, we just got to face facts on that too. Now, I have a whole set of plans to try and improve our voting rates. And this is going to sound kind of funny. It's like when you talk about securing our infrastructure from foreign interference, voting rates are actually tied to that. Because even if you tamper with an election, it's a lot easier to tamper by this much than it is like this much. The reality in 2020 is that we're going to have to run up the score by a certain amount. That's like the best way we can secure our election this time. And then long term, we have to invest meaningful resources in protecting our infrastructure and modernizing it. It's easier to do harm to one of these systems than it is to secure the system. That's one of the realities of the modern world. Like it's easier for a team of smart people to hack a system than it is to try and make that system hack-proof. And this is going to become even more true. There's something called quantum computing. Raise your hand if you've heard of quantum computing. What a smart group. So quantum computing is this next generation of computing that's going to make traditional encryption obsolete. And so you can imagine what that's going to be. Google just announced they've achieved it. So it's now possible. And so the level of encryption you're going to need over time is just going to rise. It's one reason why I'm actually excited about the potential of something like the blockchain, because in theory, the blockchain could be an answer to some of the encryption problems that we're seeing down the pike. No good answer, I'm sorry. I mean, we're in for it in 2020. Like there's no reason to think that we've changed anything meaningfully from the last cycle.
Great. Hi, George.
Hi, Professor. Hello, Andrew. My name is George.
You're not both skipping class right now, are you? I'm kidding.
No. It would be worth it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I love UBI. I think it's a great idea. One of my major concerns with UBI is that there's room for like extortion of people who may have UBI. Like I'm thinking of domestic violence situations or perhaps debts, loan sharks, that type of thing. If everybody knew that everybody was getting $1,000 a month, wouldn't there become a market of other people that would try to extort others for that money?
Well, first, to the extent that there's a market for extorting others, that market presently exists in the sense that, like people are getting money from like myriad sources. Like just because I now know that you're getting $1,000 a month doesn't all of a sudden get me out of bed and be like, ooh, now it's time to extort people. Like, because there were already people making money in like a million different ways. Now, what's interesting is I looked into this, and it is a legit question and concern. Social Security benefits are actually meant to be non-transferable and non-garnishable. Now, we don't actually protect that in real life, but the freedom dividend would be non-garnishable, non-contractable. Like if I said, hey, give me money up front, I'll give you my freedom dividend over the next 10 months, like unenforceable. You give me the money, I actually will just keep it, and then be like, hey, I guess I keep the freedom dividend too. And now, does that prevent bad behavior at the margins and like the darkness? Like no, like there'll be some, like some things that the law doesn't encompass. But the rule is, it's your money, it's non-transferable, and you can't even contract for it, you can't lend against it, you can't borrow against it. Because we do live in a country where financial institutions are always trying to find ways to like make money, and so they would come out with all these like financial instruments the next day. And so we have to say to our people, look, this is meant to be your dividend that actually ensures that you have some liberty and a foundation in the new economy, and you can't contract it, you can't lend against it, you can't borrow against it. What is interesting is that Social Security benefits do have some of the same rules, which I didn't know until I looked it up.
Time for a few more questions. The more you speak, the more questions you're getting.
Oh,
That's
also,
great.
no, also I want to say too, is that when you talk about domestic violence, you know what keeps women in these situations is that they don't have any money. They can't freaking leave the house. You know what I mean? You put money into their hands. I've talked to domestic violence survivors and victims, and they say this would be the best thing for women, because if a guy is a jerk, they'd be like, peace out. You know, like, whereas now there are millions of women who are economically dependent on their partner, who then have to put up with abuse. You know, and that's not just true in the home and the relationship. That's true in the workplace. Like, how many waitresses right now are getting harassed by their bosses, and they're like, oh, I can't leave this job because I need it. You know, like, it actually makes it so that those opportunities for abuse and harassment go way down, because it gives you the freedom to walk away and say, stick it.
Hey, how you doing? Oh. My name is Finn. My question is, will you pledge to restore protections for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and sort of oppose efforts to advance that area for leasing for offshore oil and gas drilling, and just talk about why that's important?
I would commit to protecting the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and it's part of the fact that we need to start taking the tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for oil companies and start pushing them towards solar, wind, renewable source of energy as quickly as possible. And so despoiling new parts of, of our planet for oil drilling is, to me, the opposite of the direction we should go. Now, the reality of climate change is staggering. I mean, the 4 last years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. July was the warmest month in recorded history. And I've already seen communities that are getting devastated by it. We already have climate refugees in the United States of America. We relocated a town in Louisiana that became uninhabitable because of rising water levels. I was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They had a multi-million-dollar shrimping business go to zero because of climate change. All the shrimp died. The coastal homes and buildings are flooding. So unfortunately, this is getting away from us in a very big way. And the goal has to be to try and manage the transition as quickly as possible, while acknowledging that the harm's already here. So I would invest billions of dollars in trying to make our communities more resilient. We know that when there is a natural disaster, who suffers the most? Poor people, which overlaps with people of color in this country, unfortunately. So you put money into people's hands, and it actually makes it so that people are better able to protect themselves and have shelter, or have a car to get into, or get away. And then I would build in environmental sustainability into our economic measurements. Because right now the problem is that when you say, hey, we need to fight climate change, you know, a lot of Americans here, higher costs, inconvenience, fewer jobs. And so they say, like, you know, like, this is not the direction I want to go. What you have to do is you have to try and avoid that tug of war by saying, look, economic progress and environmental progress are actually aligned. A lot of what we're going through in the United States of America is a measurement problem. So hear me out on this. That sounds nerdy, but it's fundamental, it's true. So right now, GDP is at record highs in this country. Also at record highs, suicides, drug overdoses, depression, anxiety. It's gotten so bad that our life expectancy has declined for 3 years in a row. First time in 100 years. Last time that happened was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. We're in Spanish flu territory because suicides and drug overdoses have both overtaken vehicle deaths for the first times in American history. But GDP is at record highs. So then you look at it and say, okay, like, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong is that we have this phantom GDP measurement that corresponds to very little in our day-to-day lives. And so what we have to do is we have to modify it to include our mental health and freedom from substance abuse, our health and life expectancy, how our kids are doing, and our environmental sustainability. And then if you start building in the measurements, then all of a sudden when you invest in something like renewable sources of energy, it becomes good for the bottom line. And then you try and ease this economic tension that people are using to justify trying to stay where we are.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Oh, we don't. No, apparently we do not have time.
Well, on
He's on a
behalf
tight
of the
schedule.
School of Charleston, I wanted to thank you so much for coming, Mr. Andrew Yang. I also wanted to especially thank all the professors and deans that have been a part of this Bully Pulpit series. It's been incredible to be able to be part of this, and we'd like to present you with the College of Charleston t-shirt.
Oh, thank you, Allegra. Look at this. Is it my size? Let's see. Yes. All right.
Are all y'all paying attention? Automation gonna sweep the nation unless we get him in. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend. Climate change is real again. Science rules. Teachers bringing home some bread. Medicare for every citizen. That's nice. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend.